Buddy, Jace here. I just wanted to jump on real quick before we get to the main episode to remind everybody that today, as I'm releasing this Monday, January 24th, is the final order cutoff for Supermassive, the big Image Comics crossover event between Kyle Higgins' Radiant Black, Matt Groom's Inferno Girl Red, and Ryan Parrott's Rogue Sun. Now, Inferno Girl Red and Rogue Sun as characters haven't even made their debut yet, so Supermassive will be their comic book debut. Inferno Girl Red will be showing up in OGN that was kickstarted later this year. Rogue Sun will make his debut, or make his next appearance, I should say, next week in his own self-titled comic from Image called Rogue Sun. So if you want to get his first appearance and the first appearance of Inferno Girl Red, you're going to want to pick up Supermassive. I got a chance to talk with the three writers recently. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Comic Source Podcast. I'm your host, Jace. Real pleasure to bring a guest on today who, in my mind, is a legend in the comic book industry, been around for decades, but still very much young at heart, still writing, still creating. It's my pleasure to welcome to the show Christopher Priest. Christopher, thanks for joining me.
Oh, anytime. How are you, Jace?
I'm great, man. Thanks so much for joining me. I'm excited to, you've had such a long career. I'm excited to pick your brain about kind of the state of the industry and talk about some specific things in your run. You've had so many legendary runs. Maybe we should start. I know it's, a lot of the people probably know this, but I do have a lot of younger listeners. So why don't you give us real quick, you broke in way back when, give us a quick, reminder of how you broke in at Marvel way back in the day.
Well, I think I should start by pointing out that, that anytime someone appends the word legendary to your name, it's code for, old guy that we don't want to hire anymore. So it's like, it's kind of an emeritus status, legendary writer Christopher Priest, which means he's never getting the lead on Batman, sure. So I broke into the industry, if that's what we want to call it, way back in 1978. So in those days, Stan Lee was still working in the office, and every editor on Editor's Row was also a tradesperson. In other words, like virtually every editor and even most of the assistants who worked there, they were also either a writer, an artist, a letterer, a colorist. They were all tradespeople who took a desk gig to, I guess, augment their income or whatever the story was, because nobody got paid much of anything in those days. And so like next door was Al Milgram, and his assistant was Joe Duffy, who was writing Power Man and Iron Fist at the time. And then a couple doors over, there's Denny O'Neil. My boss was Larry Hama. Down the hall from them, way in the back, you had Marv Wolfman and Len Wein was sharing an office back there. Dave Cockrum was in the back as well. Maurice Severin was the art director at the time. And then, of course, John Romita Sr. took that role over. It was just, the place was stinking with very talented people, writers, artists, so forth. I think the second year that I was there, they hired Denny O'Neil. He came over and he became an editor for Marvel. And he was right directly across the hall from us. Then Carl Potts, Michael Golden. It was an embarrassment of riches. And of course, in the early days there was Stan himself. So I landed an internship there. And I was 17 years old, coming straight from high school. And I was the person, I was the gopher. I was the guy you sent to coffee, and I was a guy making all those Xeroxes and so forth. And, my first day there, this young teenager, he comes running over to me and gives me a big hug and goes, boy, am I glad to see you. And he takes this keychain off from around his neck, and he puts it ceremoniously, drapes it over my head. And it's the key to the Xerox machine. It's like, you are now the key operator for the Xerox machine. And that kid's name was John Romita Jr. He was working in the bullpen at the time for his dad. So I figured I would work at Marvel for the semester. And then it was my senior year. So I figured I'd work at Marvel for the semester, and then I'd go on to college and go become a lawyer like my mother wanted me to become. And unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, I just never got fired. After the internship, an editor named Nelson Yomtov gave me some freelance proofreading work. And then after that, another editor named Paul Lakin hired me to come in after school and kind of look after his office, because he actually worked from his home, but he had an office in the at the Marvel offices, and he needed someone who could come and staff it. So I was coming in for a couple hours after school every day, and it just kind of hung around. And eventually Paul Lakin was succeeded by Larry Hama. And when Larry Hama found out how much I was getting paid, he went to Jim Shooter and said, they ended slavery, hundreds of years ago. You can't do this. Right. You can't. The one black kid here, you can't, pay him like that. So it was Larry who convinced Jim Shooter to actually formally put me on staff and give me a salary. It was a lousy salary, but at least it was a real salary. And I became Larry's assistant editor, and we did Crazy Magazine for a bunch of years. And then when that got canceled, I figured, okay, well, now I'll go on to school. But no, then they gave Larry Conan, and we started doing Conan, and Jim Shooter was mentoring me and teaching me writing and so forth. And then Denny O'Neil hired me for Power Man Iron Fist, and I just kind of stuck around. And my goodness, 42 years later, here we are.
Yeah, and what I find so interesting is coming up under those guys, they all have a distinct writing style. Whether it's the way Jim tells a story or Larry Hama, obviously Marv Wolfman, Len Wein, all those guys. You have a very unique style of writing, which is so different from any of those. But it feels like in your career, it took you a little longer to kind of find your voice, right? Like if I look back at things you did, like the Falcon miniseries in the 80s that you wrote, more in that traditional comic book style. But then when we talk about things like Quantum and Woody that you did at, the first iteration of Valiant, certainly Black Knight, most certainly Deathstroke that you did recently at DC, where it's that non-linear type of storytelling that's really, I think, defines the best parts of your career. Can you talk a little bit about developing that own unique voice and writing style? And like I said, it took you a while to kind of develop that, it seems.
I don't know if any of that was really conscious on my part, but I will say that Jim Shooter invested a tremendous amount of time, energy, and ultimately money in me, among other people. There was a group of us that were being brought along. I think Kurt Busiek and Len Kaminsky, and there's a couple other guys who were trying to, get established around the same time. Jim would assign me to a variety of characters, and I'd write a bunch of inventory stories that he knew he was going to burn. And by burn, I mean, he would probably assemble them all into this sort of stone soup of like a Marvel, giant special, something that you'd see at Walmart or one of the big box stores, and it'd be like this 80-page blockbuster full of like stories that Jim bought from writers he was trying to train. Learning from Jim had a very strong emphasis on structure, and he had a very rigid sense of structure that could not be violated. So I had to learn that structure, and when I became an editor, I had to enforce that structure at Marvel, which is why half of my writers no longer speak to me and don't return my phone calls, But once I passed from Jim Shooter to Denny O'Neil, I was a Denny O'Neil fan from the moment I started to realize who these writers were. Once I figured out that Cary Bates and Elliot Maggin were writing Action and Superman and so forth, and this Denny O'Neil fellow was doing this phenomenal Batman thing with some guy named Neil, you know, and I became this craven Neil Adams fan. And in fact, I started in the business trying to draw like him. I started as a writer / artist. So I came to the interview for the internship with a comic book that I had written and drawn. And I desperately wanted to be Neil Adams. I sucked. I couldn't be anywhere near Neil Adams. But the fact that I got to meet Neil and that I actually know Neil today, I feel very privileged and honored to have known him, to still know him. Sorry, still, of course, obviously Neil is still with us, and to be the recipient of some terrific advice from him. But Denny was like a father to me. Denny was literally, you know, family. He was a guy that, you know, beyond the comic book gig that you know, that I could call up and just chat up, you know, or when I'm on the East Coast, you know, that I would, you know, detour out to his house and take him to lunch and you know, let's you know, kind of visit with Dad there. I'm not ashamed to say that I loved Denny. I loved him very much, and so Denny style, David Michelinie, some of Roy Thomas, particularly Roy's X-Men stuff that he did with, again, Neil. These people had a lot of influence on me, and I like to write in a sort of, I like to write real voices, or at least as realistic as I can. So I try to keep my ear open when I'm interacting with people in life, or even if I'm watching a film, whatever like that, and I try to get rhythms and get a kind of an instinct for those voices. So skipping ahead to Quantum and Woody, you know, this is the late 90s, or, you know, yeah, right about the late 90s. So Fabian Nicieza, who is obviously, you know, a big deal X-Men, you know, writer. Oof, I'm a big man. Fabian, right? So Fabian was hired over at the Acclaim Video Games to develop a comic book line for them. He reached out to me and said, look, we would like to do like a buddy superhero book, something like Power Man and Iron Fist. And whoever he was talking to at the time said, well, why don't you actually call the guys who did Power Man and Iron Fist? You know, we'll stop screwing around. You know, so I got the call from Fabian, and we talked about it. But the difference between Fabian and, say, working at Marvel, which was still under Shooter and ultimately under Tom DeFalco, who was another one of my mentors, another guy that taught me an awful lot, was that at Acclaim, it was like the kids were running the store. Right. You know, it was like, you know, Fabian was, that may have been the best work experience of my entire career. I loved working at Acclaim. It was so much fun. And Fabian was like, so not the jerk. You know, he was so not the taskmaster. He was like the complete opposite of what I was used to. And Fabian kind of freed us up from the rigidity of the Marvel template. And I got to explore different things and so forth. But at the time, I was doing a subversive book at DC called Steel. Right. And Steel, I was working with my editor, Frank Pitteries, and the phenomenally talented Dennis Cowan, who was also, you know, a longtime friend. We were friends at 17 trying to break in, you know. Right. You know, he was working for Rich Buckler and I was over at Marvel. We were doing a subversive deconstruction of Superman, where we had like a dysfunctional Superman set in a dysfunctional metropolis, which was Jersey City. And he had like a dysfunctional Lois Lane, Amanda Quick, his quixotic, I should say, love interest, and a dysfunctional Jimmy Olsen, which was his niece, Natasha. And basically John Henry Irons was the only sane person in that book. And everything else was like this sort of cynical deconstruction and commentary on the Superman mythos. And Frank and I, the editor, we had great fun putting this together. And obviously Dennis, because Dennis, the pages came in and Dennis had really taken the Steel design, which I always thought was, no offense to the artist or to my dear friend Louise Simonson, I just thought that the Steel outfit was just goofy looking. And Dennis, in the name of God, came back with this incredible friggin' design where he had just, it's the same basic idea of the Steel suit, but Dennis had just so cowaned it up. Mm-hmm. And it was just, you're talking about, my style being unusual. There's nobody that looks like Dennis but Dennis, right. And he had just so elevated my thinking about the character. And then in the comic book, when Steel took his helmet off, I looked at it and went, this is Dwayne McDuffie. So I called Dennis. I went, what are you doing? You're drawing Dwayne. No, I'm not. Yes, you are. No, I'm not. No, that's Dwayne. It isn't Dwayne. And he swore, through the whole thing that that's not Dwayne. But I guarantee you he was drawing Dwayne McDuffie. And so I shrugged and I said, well, screw it. I'll just write Dwayne McDuffie. So anyone who knew Dwayne, and for anyone who wanted to know Dwayne, I would invite you to go back to at least the first 12 issues or so of Dennis Cowan's and my run on Steel. And you will see my impression of Dwayne McDuffie, whom I loved very dearly and whom I considered basically the smartest man I've ever met in my entire life. And I'm like, well, what if Dwayne McDuffie was a superhero? So that's kind of, what we end up doing there. So
I haven't read that run in years. I'm going to have to go back now, probably this weekend. And
it's the deconstruction of Superman, and it stars Dwayne McDuffie. But anyway, so I was already in that mindset where we were doing this and we were getting away with it at DC because no one cared about Steel and nobody in editorial, at least, was reading it, except obviously our editor, Frank. So we were flying well under the radar and no one paid us any attention until Frank left and another editor came in and he said, no, we want to make this a very generic Superman family book. We want to mold it back into the, to the mainstream of things. And I lost interest in that and kind of drifted away. But anyway, so Quantum Woody started at the time when we were just doing the subversive Steel thing. So Quantum Woody became almost an extension where I went, well, how far out on a limb can I go? Mm-hmm. And then in comics, it's always like, hey, we would like you to work for us. We want to offer you this great deal. And by the way, you're 6 months late, right? So right, yeah. I had to do the first issue of Quantum Woody while I was on the road, while I was running around to conventions and so forth and working out of a hotel room. So I literally was just making this stuff up as fast as possible. And I started moving things out of sequence because it felt funnier and it felt like, and I think I had this discussion today with my Vampirella editor, with Matt Idelson. I said, the reason I work out of sequence a lot of times is that we've only got 20 pages and I'm trying to get to the good stuff. Right. I'm trying to get to the stuff that the readers care about. And if I told the story linearly, I would lose half my audience because it'd be issue 3 before anything happened. Mm-hmm. So it kind of began like that. Now, when we got to Black Panther, I think you said Black Knight. Yeah, I think you meant Black Panther.
Yeah, Black Panther. Sorry.
That's okay.
Marvel Knight. I was thinking probably Marvel Knights.
Black Panther, yeah, right? Yeah. Black Knight. Okay. So when I got to Black Panther, I turned in my first issue script, and it was a very traditional script. From the jungles of Wakanda stalks the stealthy cat, and it was a very sort of like once upon a time from the mists of the jungle comes the, and I turned that in and went on back to whatever else I was writing. And a week or two later, I got a call from Joe Quesada. He goes, what's this? I was like, well, that's Black Panther. And he goes, we don't want this. We didn't hire you to write this. We don't want a traditional Black Panther book. And I had Joe and Jimmy on Jimmy Palmiotti, and they were conferenced in. And he said, essentially, I don't remember the exact words, but essentially that, we didn't hire you to do standard superhero. There's any number of people we could hire to do that. We hired you to do what you do in Quantum and Woody. We want that weird out of sequence thing and so forth. And one of the caveats when they talked me into Black Panther, and there was some talking in, there was some arm twisting to get me to do it in the first place. But I said, well, one of the things that there's two things I insisted on. One is that Black Panther can't get beat up anymore. I just won't tolerate it. Mm-hmm. You know, if I'm writing Black Panther, then he's the badass. He's the guy that you got to look out for, you know. And then number two, I said, you know, it's going to be funny. And Black Panther had never been funny. And I don't think it's all that funny now. You know, well, I don't know. I don't want to disparage anybody. I haven't read Black Panther in quite some time. But you know, I said, you know, there's no reason why we can't put humor in the book in a way that does not diminish the character, you know, and I think we successfully did that, where we added humor to the book while at the same time, you know, we retained the integrity of the character so that Black Panther himself was not the butt of the jokes. But if anything, Black Panther was the punchline, where he comes in and just clocks Mephisto, you know, takes him out with one punch. You know, so basically, you know, it was kind of a progressive rebellion against the Marvel template that I had trained on, and that for years when I was writing the Falcon or Conan or Power Man and Iron Fist, that I adhered to very strictly because that's what the boss insisted on. And then I enforced it when I was the Spider-Man editor. And I was working with Tom DeFalco and David Michelinie, which was a real joy that I actually got to hire David Michelinie and work with him, a tremendously gifted writer. You know, but Peter David, which is a whole another hour of discussion, you know, a brilliant writer that I had to put through the meat grinder, because I had to take this person who was incredibly creative and thought way outside the box in ways that would never occur to me. And I had to often have him rewrite his scripts into a more conventional form to satisfy, you know, the bosses down the hall, which I thought was unfortunate.
Yeah, when I look at something like the Falcon, and it's not that there's not something there, you know, maybe a little bit product of its time, a little bit of the angry black man, and it's great to see how far he's come, you know, both in comics, you know, being Captain America, and now, you know, in the films, in the MCU, he's going to be Captain America. It's a bit of an elevation, but it was great to see the fact that, and I had no idea that you'd made that caveat, hey, Black Panther's going to be the badass, right? Because it had gone from being, you know, here's the black guy, he's got to be the sidekick, he's got to be the weaker, you know, part of the Captain America Falcon team, to get to a point with Black Panther of, no, he is the badass, and it was a long time coming, and obviously we still have a ways to go. And then, you know, eventually to have the Black Panther film come out, in a way like validating a lot of what you had done, because it pulled so much from what you guys did on your Marvel Knights Black Panther run. So that must have been a real joy for you to experience a lot of the ideas and kind of the characterization that you had developed for Black Panther, to see it up there on the big screen. Can you talk a little bit about, like, you know, black characters and how they have evolved? Like, they're no longer those stereotypes. I mean, it has gotten better, right?
Well, I think so. I think it's gotten better. I think now we're kind of in an odd place that's a little dangerous, where like for a while the industry had started, instead of hiring writers, they started casting writers. You know, right. Like I stopped writing comics completely for nearly a decade. I got really disenchanted when I was writing Captain America and the Falcon, and there was a second Captain America book being published by Marvel Knights. So the Marvel Knights Captain America book was going away, and I thought that wow, I'm sorry, I'm having a senior moment here. I thought that my artist and I, and forgive me, gosh. Wow, why am I having a hard time remembering his name? I thought that the artist and I had done a really good job on Captain America and Falcon, and I felt like that we had earned our shot at the main book. Mm-hmm. So when they went from 2 Cap books to 1 Cap book, I thought, well, here's our shot. Here we go. Mm-hmm. And then I got the call from Marvel where they said, you know, we got this great idea. what we're going to do is we're going to take Captain America out of the book, and we're going to relaunch it as the Falcon. And we're going to get you a #1, and we're going to promote it and all this other stuff. And it just felt like a punch in the face. And at some point over the years, I had gone from being a writer who was writing Spider-Man, who had relaunched Green Lantern, who wrote Power Man, Iron Fist, and obviously Quantum Woody, and this litany of stuff. And somehow I had stopped being a writer, and I had become a Black writer. And this angers people. I'm not sure why, so maybe I'm not as woke as I should be, but it angers people when I bring this up, when I say that I don't want to be known as a Black writer. I want to be competitive on the same level as anybody else. I am a writer who happens to be Black. There's no reason why I can't write any character. Why should I be limited to only writing Black characters? But for nearly a decade, every time the phone rang, it was only from Marvel or DC. It was like, ooh, we're getting ready to relaunch Black Goliath. And we were looking at, that kind of became an issue. As for Black Panther, I think the moment where Black Panther crossed the Rubicon and became sort of a player again was in our first issue of Marvel Knights. There's this scene where he's chasing some bad guy, and the guy is driving this Mustang, and the guy drives the Mustang, in a panic, he drives the Mustang off a pier, and they go into the river, and then you cut to inside the car, and they're inverted, they're upside down inside the car, and Black Panther has grabbed this guy, and it's like a real Batman move. He's grabbed this guy and he's snarling in his face, and he's threatening him. He's going, from now on you belong to me. You're going to do exactly what I tell you to do, or I will carve your heart like a roast, something like that.
Right.
And we had not seen that. I don't think we've ever seen that Black Panther. And Mark Texeira working over Joe Quesada's layouts, and it was just astounding artwork that just landed it where we went, okay, there's a new sheriff in town. And I don't necessarily mean me. I just mean when I decided to take on Black Panther, I went back to Fantastic Four. I went back to Stan and Jack. And I asked myself, what did Stan actually intend for this character? There's been a lot of Black Panther's had a lot of daddies and had a lot of different interpretations, and a lot of great things have been added. A lot of different things have been added. But by that time, Panther was kind of like the guy in the back of the class picture. It was like I was babysitting Justice League for 10 issues. I won't say I wrote Justice League. I'll say I was given custody of Justice League because Scott Snyder was supposed to come on the book, but he got delayed because he was writing Metal, and I said, ooh, I'll do it. So I did, this very short Justice League run. And in every issue of my Justice League, every single issue, at some point in the script, I would stop and go, where's Aquaman? Because I had forgotten Aquaman.
Right.
Damn it, where's Aquaman? And I have to go back and go, okay, because every character needs to have some agency,
Right.
if you're writing a group book. And I don't know why, maybe it's a mental block, but I kept forgetting Aquaman. And, at that point in Panther's history, when he became when he was handed over to Marvel Knights, he had become Aquaman. He had become this character that was kind of like, oh yeah, and there's Black Panther. So we wanted to actually restore that agency. But and then when we began that series, we got criticized a lot because now Black Panther had these gadgets and he had this high technology and his suit was bulletproof, and people were offended by that. And in those days, there was no email. People had to actually write a letter.
Right.
Jace, I mean, they licked a stamp. You understand? That's how angry they were.
Wow.
And they walked this thing. Yeah, and they walked this thing to the mailbox to tell us what a-holes we were, right? And we would get this stuff, and Jimmy and Joe and Nancy, they would read this stuff to me over the phone, and it would be hysterical about these people, just up in arms that we gave Black Panther an iPhone. How dare you? Because the iPhone hadn't been invented yet. There was no iPhone. And they thought, how preposterous that you can hold this thing in your hand and there's a picture and go, oh, come on, please give me a break. Right. And we would get letters like that, and when I tell this story now at conventions, nobody believes me. They think he's just, there's eye rolling and like, yeah, right. I'm telling you, the purists were really offended. But if you go back to the first appearance of Black Panther, what do you see? Here's a guy who's rich. He is a head of state. He has technological prowess. He built with his own hands most of those toys and gadgets you see. He has this advanced civilization, and he beat Marvel's premier family team all by himself, single-handedly, and then laughed about it. Right? And I went, I want to write that guy. What is the 1990s version of that guy?
Right.
And that's what I did. And it pissed everybody off because over the years, people had forgotten who Black Panther was and and they started confusing him with Tarzan. He's not Tarzan. He's never been Tarzan. And I hope he never becomes Tarzan again. So to get back to your question, I'm sorry, I'm all over the place. But that's what editing's for. Just cut me out. But get back to your question. I think that, that publishers had become much more sensitive to, to how they approach these characters, to how they approach characters of color, how they approach characters of different sexuality or different orientations, and also with the advent of the internet, with the advent of the Twitter, what the thumbs, with this, they've realized they have to become much more responsive. But now we've moved to an area where they're becoming incredibly, and in some cases overly cautious and risk averse, because now there's all this movie money at stake.
Right. Yeah.
So there's a lot of times when, I'm doing a storyline in Vampirella that unfortunately I can't give away why it's going to cause a lot of noise because then I'd be spoiling it.
Right.
But trust me, we're what, January 21st here. It's going to make a lot of noise. I'll be lucky to work in the business again after this comes out, because it's incredibly controversial. And I think that there's a real possibility of people being offended because, if I wanted to write a lesbian Chinese serial killer, it's like, well, I have to be a lesbian Chinese serial killer. I mean, that's how risk averse we're become now, where we're getting back to that casting of writers as opposed to just hiring a writer, where I believe any writer, a straight white male writer, like look at the TV show The Wire. The Wire was set in Baltimore, deal with a mainly African American cast, and dealt with African American with those issues, and it had some of the most authentic dialogue and authentic cultural references there. And who wrote that show? Two middle-aged white guys, right? And now there'd be people who would be offended and up in arms. Well, why don't you give a black writer a shot at the? Oh, stop. I feel like when you start talking about diversity in comics or diversity in hiring, to me, diversity is not, hiring me to write the Black Spider-Man. Diversity is hiring me to write Spider-Man, to allow me to compete on an even playing field. When I met Ta-Nehisi Coates, who I have a great deal of respect for, but first of all, I said, why do you want to write comics? You have a real job,
right?
I just didn't get that, But when I met him, I told him, so I told him what I've said to other people. I said, well, Marvel hiring you to do Black Panther, that really don't impress me. If you want to impress me, hire Ta-Nehisi Coates to write Superman. That's a book. That's a book I want to read. Because Superman has never been written by someone who sees through Ta-Nehisi Coates' eyes.
Right.
right? So the closest we got to it, we're close to it because he's writing Captain America, and I'm really glad to see that happening. But that's the kind of diversity that I'm talking about. Why should we limit, somebody like Amy Chu to only write female characters? And I don't know that that's happening. I'm just throwing that out there,
Right.
But why should we put these barriers in place? A writer is like an actor. An actor, a great actor, would consider it a challenge to play a variety of characters, ethnicities, even genders. And we're really not allowed to do that anymore. So, so things are better, Jace. And I think we're at a place where we're being so overly cautious that we're limiting our horizons unnecessarily.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I've had conversations, and I get why some people are, they say, well, no, we need to acknowledge, writers of different orientations or what have you. But my point, I tend to look a little farther into the future than that. Like, for me, Christopher, when we have succeeded is when the labels disappear, and it's not a female writer or a Black writer. It's just a writer. Like, I want to get to the point in our society where the labels aren't there. You know what I mean? Like, you no longer, and maybe it's, naivete on my part, but I want to get to the point where the labels are gone, because they're just a person. They're just a human. We all have much more in common than we have, different. Just because your skin's darker than mine, if you want to talk about like on a genetic level, our differences are what, 0.00001%, like we are way more alike than different. So if we can get to the point where we're just all telling stories here, right? Because I believe that you can tell a lot about a society with the stories they're fictions, the stories that they make. What's important to them? We'll look at the stories that they make. And so, yeah, I agree with you. And well, getting more.
Let me jump back in here. So what's interesting to me, though, Jace, is that going all the way back to, the Shooter days, is that I worked with Shooter for, 8 years, 10 years, however long that was. At no point in our working together did the issue of race even come up.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't even discussed, at least not between me and Jim. It just didn't come up. We talked about Iron Man. We talked about who is Spider-Man, who is Peter Parker, what does Peter Parker want? I spent 1,000 hours on Tom DeFalco's couch, in his office, where Tom is talking to me about story, about structure, about, this sort of things. And at no point did either of these guys, either of those people, it just didn't come up, it really didn't. And, at some point somebody pointed out, well, you're the first Black editor, and, when I say the first Black writer, now people want to go, well, this Black writer wrote an issue of this, and that Black writer. I'm the first Black writer that was, landed a series at Marvel or DC. I think we can clearly say that. Whatever. But I wasn't even aware at the time that I was the first Black anything. I was just happy to be there.
Right.
And these people were like family. And I literally grew up in the halls of Marvel Comics, from a teenager to an adult. And I never once really gave a whole lot of thought to the whole issue of race until they did, Marvel did something right after Farm Aid. I think Marvel did something called it was a charity book for famine relief in Africa, and they had advertised it as like, our very top talent, the best of the best, have gathered together and donated their talents, and we're doing this famine relief book, and they were trumpeting, this amazing project, and and all these great writers and artists were donating their time, and I went looking through the talent list and realized that there were no Black people invited to work on this book. So I was sitting in my office. I was the Spider-Man editor at the time, and I picked up my phone. And I called Larry Hama, whose office was down the hall. And I said, hey, Larry, did you look at this list for the famine release book here? And he said, yeah. And I said, well, did you notice there's no Black people, there's no working on it. They didn't invite any Black people to work on it, And he laughed for a second. He said, well, I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll do our own, relief book for the, for the poor white trash of Appalachia. Well, I shouldn't have said that. No, I don't want to put that on Larry. Well, he may have said something like that, you know. And no offense to the people of Appalachia. My family's from Appalachia. We're all from Kentucky, from the hills of Kentucky. We're all a bunch of barefoot rednecks. So, you know, I'm one of those people there. But we made this little joke. And there was an editor who I won't mention who was standing in the hallway outside my open door when I was having this conversation with Larry, and he overheard me making this, and we giggled about it, and I hung up and I went on with my life. And you know, it wasn't that big a deal to me, but this editor overheard this and went down the hall and said, well, you know, Jim is planning this protest over this, you know, famine relief book. And it got no, I'm serious. And it got the whole office very stirred up. And then the editor of the famine relief book, you know, appeared in my office, and she's screaming at me at the top of her lungs. And how dare you, and blah, 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 this and that. And now she's crying now. And it's this whole thing. And I went, I'm not, what are you talking about? I'm not, I just made a joke. I'm not, you know, and you know, and it's one of these things, Jace, where, you know, where you catch somebody who did something wrong and they go on the attack, you understand? Rather than just go, wow, this is really embarrassing that we didn't invite Dennis Cowan or Ron Wilson or you know, any number of these, you know, people of color to work on it. You didn't invite any of us because we weren't the best of the best. You invited the best of the best, you know. But I got really attacked for it. And that's probably the first time that race at Marvel, you know, was like all of a sudden this issue, you know, where now Jim Shooter has to come in. Now he has to be dad. So he has to come in my office, and now he's, you know, he's coming in and he's like, you know, well, you know, we really don't want to cause a big, and it seemed, Jace, it's like no matter how many times I said that I wasn't starting a protest, that I made a private joke to my mentor and friend, Larry. We shared a moment of levity and we both forgot about it. And somebody else went off. But it's one of these things that just, it's like the TV show The Office, where it just escalates into this ridiculous thing.
Right.
The only other time that happened was, and this is the same editor, by the way. These are two incidents, same guy. And I'm biting my tongue not to mention his name, because I just went, you know, why don't you talk to me? Why don't you talk to me? Don't go running down the hall. Talk to me. Right. Anyway, so, you know, one day the freelancers would come in and pick up their checks on Friday, okay? And this particular Friday, the checks were late. So there was a lot of freelancers in the office, and they were all kind of milling about because they're waiting for the checks to come down. So in my offices, Trevor Von Eden, Ron Wilson, Keith Williams was my assistant, so he worked there. He needed to be there. Mark Beecham showed up that day. Who else was in the office that day? Kyle Baker showed up that day. There was like any number. Dennis came in. Dennis Cowan came in that day. Now, usually when these guys come in, particularly these guys, they would make a beeline to my office and they would park all their crap in there. So there was all of these backpacks and portfolios and whatever. So they would park their stuff in my office, and then they go trolling up and down the hall to see different editors, whatever. But they would start in my office and they'd end up back in my office. And I had a tiny little office next door to the executive vice president, the publisher, Mike Hobson, who was on the other side of this wall and would pound on the wall and tell me to turn the stereo down, right? You know, so it's, you know, this particular week, there was all these guys in my office. And also Joe Rubenstein. Joe Rubenstein would always make my office this first stop. Bob Layton was typically also parked in my office. So anyway, the following Monday, Shooter shows up in my office, and he's got this very sheepish look on his face, and he's like, I need to talk to you. And I went, okay. And he says, well, it's been reported to me, and he does one of these. He goes, and I feel really stupid about having to bring this up, you know, but, you know, he asked for the editor-in-chief job, so he's got to bring it up. So it's been reported to me, and I found out by the same schmuck from the first story that you apparently, you're firing all the white people and replacing them with black people. With a straight face, right?
I don't know how you kept a straight face.
So I looked at him, and I just didn't know what to say. So I just looked at him and I went, you know, and you have that Terminator moment where like, all this data comes on the screen, like, which answer to give Jim Shooter, and I just said, the answer in my head said, don't feed this. He's embarrassed enough by being here. Jim and I were very close, in fact, they used to call me Little Shooter because, I was like his protege. So I just looked at him and I said very softly, no, Jim, I'm not firing all the white people and hiring the black people, and I said, well, the reason why there were so many black people in my office that day was that the checks were late, number one. And number two is that the reason why they were in my office is that they feel welcome in my office.
Right.
And maybe that's a question you should ask, some of your other editors rather than pick on me about it. But just to make sure we were all on the same page, I typed up this notorious memo and distributed it to, this is before email, so you actually had paper memos that you had to distribute with these inter-office envelopes. So I typed up this memorandum called, the Marvel White Supremacy Memorandum. Okay, and in it I listed all the African American writers and artists that I was working with, and specifically what they were working on, so people wouldn't think, and what they're working on, so people wouldn't think that I was firing all the white people or replacing them with black people. And I had this whole list, Kyle Baker and Ron Wilson and Mark Beecham and so forth, and Bob Layton, because he's so dark, he fooled me, and, and so I had Bob Layton and Joe Rubenstein was on that list as well, because, he's kind of shady too,
right,
so we put them all on the list there. And we all had a big laugh, and that was the end of that. But it just kind of exposed, well, I'm just wondering, are people like really huddling around the office and they're afraid to talk to me about these things? Really? Because I never considered Marvel to be a particularly, racist place.
Right.
But then again, I really wasn't looking. Sometimes you have to look for it,
Mm-hmm.
And if they're making Italian jokes and they're making Jewish jokes, and if they're, it was savagely unpolitically correct there. The only ethnic group that was safe was Polish people. There were no Polish jokes told at Marvel. Do you know why?
Because Jim was Polish?
I'm sure.
That makes sense. Yeah.
I never heard even one Polish joke told at Marvel, but so if there were racist cracks, there was also sexist cracks, and there were Jewish cracks, and there were, you name it, and we all gave as good as we got. And I never really thought much about it, until incidents like this would happen that would kind of expose like, wow. But what really kind of broke my heart was that I considered these people family.
Mm-hmm.
And instead of the editor of that famine relief book, instead of her coming in my office and attacking me, why didn't you just talk to me? And the guy who went to her in the first place, why don't you just talk to me? I would have told you, nobody knows what color these people are. And the fact that they volunteered their time to do this book, that's major. That's wonderful, and I'm happy for that. I'm just making a little joke, and you kind of expose yourself to that kind of humor, let's be honest. But beyond that, I'm not mounting any crusade, and I don't have a chip on my shoulder, and I'm not racially oversensitive. It's one of these things. But there was lots of times where things would appear in the comics that were either offensive to that I considered were offensive to black people, or were just incredibly incorrect or inaccurate, and it would baffle me, like, why don't you run this by me? I mean, I'm sitting right here next to Mike Hobson. If you're not sure if this is savvy or whatever, why don't you show it to an actual black person? And I had this happen, even like within the last couple of years. There was a project I was doing at Marvel, and I got the notes back like, well, this is going to be really offensive. No, it was not. I'm sorry, it wasn't Marvel. Sorry, Marvel. It was DC. This is going to be really offensive to black people. You can't do this. And I said, you're telling me
yeah,
what's offensive to black people? And he said, well, we got a bunch of people in the room. We went around the room and we all agreed that we'd really rather not, you didn't do this because, and I said, well, let me ask you something. This room that you were going around, were there any black people in the room?
Yeah.
No. And I said, so we got a bunch of white liberals who are going to tell me what offends black people. And that happens more often than you can imagine because of how risk averse everybody is. But I don't know if they really understand how ridiculous it is, to trust your judgment over mine, particularly when these days and times, Jason, nobody buys a comic book who doesn't know who the creators are, because the creators are really what's selling the books even more so than the characters. So, we know who Brian Bendis is. We know who Scott Snyder is, certainly I think that people, who are familiar with me or familiar with my work, they know I'm black, which is not an excuse, but, it is sort of like, I hate to say it, but there is the double standard where a Jewish comedian can tell Jewish jokes and a black comedian can tell black jokes, but not vice versa. Right. So, I'm writing something now where I have this black character saying some pretty insensitive things. And that's passing muster, and nobody at DC is having a problem with that. But there's a Jewish guy, an old Jewish guy in the book, and I'm writing him Curb Your Enthusiasm.
Larry David.
Larry David. So I'm basically parroting Larry David. So somebody comes running out of a door and is startled to see this character standing there, and he's an old Jewish guy, and he goes, sorry for the old Jews stalking in the shadows bit, and I got the notes back. Well, you really can't say that. You can say all this black stuff as much as you want, but you're not Jewish,
right.
And I'm like, oh.
Yeah, it's that double-edged sword. It's clear that we're aware, and we don't, you don't want to take it too far, but yeah, I agree with you. It's like you said, it's so much to do with, now that these the big two are owned by these giant corporations, and it's all about the movie money. And when it first started happening, when Iron Man came out in 2008, and all of a sudden comic book movies became the center of pop culture, as a lifelong comic fan, I was excited. And then after a few years, when I saw how much it influenced the books, and it felt like it was removing creativity from the books, and the books were becoming homogenized, I came to realize, and I believe now, that it's actually a detriment to the comic. I think the success of all these comic book movies is actually a detriment, because there are more eyes on it. And you, as a writer, as a creator, you guys just don't have the freedom that you once had. And I can't believe 12-year-old me wouldn't believe that that's true. But I've actually come around to that way of thinking. I almost wish it was kind of still the underground thing that you didn't talk about, because then at least we'd get more original stuff. Now, that's not to say that in the creator-owned space and the independent space, we aren't getting, kind of a golden age right now, because there's some fantastic stuff. But when it comes to the big two, it's like, it feels like a regurgitation of sort of the same old thing we've had for decades.
Well, it's all the more ironic because the audience is not following us from the movie theater into the comic stores.
Right, exactly.
And it's kind of upsetting because, C.B. Cebulski, has to turn a profit on these books, which seems ludicrous. If you think about how many billions of dollars these properties are generating that CB does not get credit for. I just did a U.S. Agent series for Marvel that became a real eye opener because I knew Mark Gruenwald. He was a friend of mine, and when I was approached to write this series, I don't know why, Jace. I just thought, well, U.S. Agent. Well, he's kind of an asshole. Excuse me, but he's kind of an asshole.
I mean, if you go back to Mark's run, that's who he was, the character you loved to like. If you were reading Mark's run at the time, you hated that guy. He was an asshole, a huge one.
So I wrote him with much more edge than actually ended up in print, because there was a lot of things that the editor that Tom approved that later got notes back from standards and practices. because they're putting the character in the streaming series and they're very protective of the character. But these are two separate audiences, Jace, and it really frustrated me, and I'm sure it caused problems for Tom, because I wrote a very different character, and it was edgy and funny, and he was, but at the same time, while he was being, I don't think that U.S. Agent is necessarily racist. I think the point I was trying to make is that he exists in this alternate reality of his, where he is certainly not politically correct. Like, he kept calling his sidekick a Chinaman. Well, his sidekick was Japanese, and the guy would push back and give as good as he got and go, "Hey, jerk, I'm not even Chinese, but that's really offensive." He would call him on the behavior. We would balance it out by letting him be, a bit offensive, and then call him on the behavior. But we had to round the corners off of a lot of that. And had I known that going in, I probably would not have taken the assignment on, because what interested me about the assignment was like this sort of, untethered, subversive version of Captain America. Right. And I didn't get to write that. I had to kind of clean him up way too much. I wanted him to be a much bigger jerk than he was in the comic book.
Yeah, well, you wanted to go back to his roots, to what Mark created.
Yeah.
And listen to what you just said. Like, think about that for a second, what you just said, Christopher. So you couldn't have imagined when you broke in and first started, or not when you broke in, but when you first started writing, you got notes from standards and practice. What the hell? Why is there a standards and practices division for a company that's making comic books? You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, because it's a studio, but I don't think the studio understands that these are two separate audiences, and the crossover is not nearly as great. So if you go back to Marvel Knights Black Panther, so I had this character Everett Ross, he was a transplant from my Kazar series. Mm-hmm. Black Panther's State Department handler. And I based him, he looked like Michael J. Fox, but he talked like Matthew Perry from Friends. Mm. That was the speech pattern, So I kept hearing Matthew Perry, and that's who I, desperately wanted for the movie, actually.
He would have been fantastic.
Just that sort of like fish out of water, bit that he is so famous for. But if you go back and reread those first, 4 to 6 issues, whatever, of that Marvel Knights run, the Ross character is saying some incredibly racist things. Because the Ross character, the function of that character was to validate the reservations of a white fan base that was reluctant to buy a black character. So I wanted him to say all the things that I knew white fans would either say or would be thinking. They may not vocalize it, but they're like, well, here's a character that I cannot identify with because he's nothing like me, and he has no powers, and why should I buy this book about this guy from the jungle? So Ross would be saying these incredibly racist things. He just assumed that Black Panther would check into the Waldorf and order up some ribs, and that would be like the end of it. And Ross goes to pick him up at the airport in his 2-seater Mazda Miata, and of course Panther shows up with this enormous entourage with all of his people, Zuri and all the Doras and the whole thing, and Panther, not wanting to offend his host, insists that they must ride with him. So he piles everybody into Miata, and this is the kind of fun that we had back then, and then they end up in New Lots, which is not a great area of Brooklyn. They end up in the New Lots area of Brooklyn, and Ross is very nervous because it's the hood, and he was told that there would be singing, that people would be standing around garbage cans, and it's doing this incredible harmony, that's what he was looking for, and he's like, I was lied to, and I could not get that through Marvel today. That none of that stuff would fly today. It would be considered way too incendiary and way too racist, but all it was doing was opening a door for this particular group of readers and giving them a character that they can identify with. And also, my vision of Black Panther was a very taciturn guy. He was a guy that didn't talk much. He talked less than Clint Eastwood. He didn't talk very much, so I didn't want to have all these first person narratives, and then I thought that I ache, the Chris Claremont stuff. And I love Chris to death. And Chris, I left him off my list. Chris, Roger Stern, these are people that I just, amazing writers. Anyway, so, I needed the characters, the supporting cast to define Panther for the reader. So we saw, my being sort of typecast as a Black writer after Black Panther just struck me as ridiculous, because Black Panther was never about the Black guy in the first place.
Right.
Black Panther was about Everett K. Ross and about his cultural awakening and how and changing how he saw, this man, because all he saw was a Black guy, and he had to learn that, like, King, he's a king, by the way, King T'Challa, is so much more than the color of his skin. And that's the journey that the character is on. And that was the journey that I took the readers on as well. And I'm glad to see that after my run, because my run wasn't very commercially successful, but after my run, that Reginald Hudlin came in. And Reginald Hudlin really is the unsung hero of Black Panther, because he's the one, he and John Romita Jr. are the ones who made Black Panther commercially viable. Now the numbers are kicking into high gear, and the book got picked up all over the place, and now, subsequent writers after Reginald, and now obviously Ta-Nehisi Coates and Brian Stelfreeze, took it to like this whole other level, but it really kind of, it really bothered me, and it got me to the point where I'd rather just do something else than to accept this, this cubby holing, this limitation, not just on my skills, but on my person, on who I am as a person.
Right.
He's a Black writer. I went, I wrote Peter Parker forever, and with the Black Panther thing, I was writing Everett Ross even more so than I was writing Panther, and it's ridiculous for you to just limit me like that. And I'm really glad that at some point DC reached out to me and said Deathstroke, and my first reaction was like, is he Black? and the editor said no, and I went, okay, I'm listening. And we had a conversation about Deathstroke. So it's rare in life that you get a second bite at it, that you get a second swing at it, that you get another 15 minutes. And then I started writing Deathstroke, and all of a sudden I started reading all these things online. Priest is back. And I never left. They left me. I didn't go anywhere. Yeah. And then I started being offered literally all kinds of things. And I'm happy to say that I feel, at least at the moment, I feel like that I'm competitive in ways that I was not, that I hadn't been for quite a long time.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about Deathstroke, because for me, that's my favorite thing you've ever done. You did so many just fantastic things. I want to dive into some of it, but I want to say one more thing about Black Panther and your point about the fact that you weren't writing a Black Panther book, you were writing an Everett K. Ross book. Validated right away by those letters that you mentioned that you were getting. You clearly knew, right, that these were the things that people weren't gonna get. Like, oh, how he's supposed to be this guy, this throwback Tarzan in the jungle character.
Right.
No, just because he's Black doesn't mean he's primitive or a savage or whatever, like, so you were onto it
and that he's capable, because Ross kept going, like, Mephisto's coming, Mephisto shows up at the apartment and Ross turns to Panther and goes, should we call the Avengers? And Panther goes, why? And he just runs over and decks him, right?
Yeah, exactly.
They're walking down the street in Harlem and or whatever, wherever this was. And Panther grabs some bad guy by his hair and scales the side of a building. I think that Joe and Jimmy and I and Nancy, our editor, we were all on the same page that, like, it's not like we wanted to turn Black Panther into a badass. Black Panther always was a badass, and he just hasn't been written like that in a long time. But go back to those Fantastic Four issues, and read that again and see how he just opens up a can of whoop ass on the Fantastic Four. If he can beat the Fantastic Four, he can handle a couple of street fuck. Come on, Jace.
Yep, 100%. All right, let's talk about Deathstroke, though, because here's the thing, right? Not that people hadn't done some layering of the character of Slade Wilson before. He'd had his own series, obviously created by Marv Wolfman and George Perez, and fantastically, well received, a great villain. But so many times he would revert to kind of this mustache twirling, two-dimensional guy, right? You never wrote him that way. He was always such a complex character, like the way you portrayed his love for his family, but it was, not in a traditional way, but yet you knew that he cared about his sons. Like, I just thought it was fantastic. So, like, what was your in? Like, what clicked for you when you accepted the offer to take the book, that you said, okay, I know who this guy is. I'm going to break him down in ways he's never been broken down before, and then kind of put him back together?
Well, I don't know. Well, first of all, I was Marv Wolfman's intern back at Marvel.
Mm-hmm.
So when I was 17, I spent most of my waking hours Xeroxing pages, Gene Colan's gorgeous artwork from Tomb of Dracula,
yeah,
over and over and over and over. I mean, Marv always wanted more copies of whatever the hell. Marv, please, Marv. And then, of course, I was reading the Teen Titans, the whole Deathstroke thing, and Marv and George, just huge fans of both of these guys. So the Deathstroke character, I had an affinity for the character, and I liked the challenge of writing a villain because it's the rare villain that was able to sustain a monthly title, and I realized that going in that might be a hindrance, that the guy is a villain. Beyond that, I just at every opportunity want to stress Jeff Johns' involvement in this. At some point, they put me on the phone with Jeff, and we had a discussion about it. And what I said to Jeff was that, okay, if we're doing this rebirth thing, if we have the opportunity to do whatever we want in terms of repositioning the character, then why not reposition the character in a way that translates more directly to streaming or motion picture or whatever? So I want to do a very realistic take on the character. I want to, I'm more of the Denny O'Neil school, where I desperately want to do my Green Lantern, Green Arrow series, which actually got the green light at DC last year, and then it got put on hold. So that may actually happen. But there's actually a first issue of that in the can somewhere.
Oh, wow.
of a Green Lantern, Green Arrow revival.
I would love to read that for sure.
And a whole new road trip, with Ollie and Hal, I think one of my, I don't say conditions, but I just said, look, I'd like to do it if I could, if I could take him seriously. And if I could, I can't do the, I can't do that, So basically my whole idea was like, people, not people, but the traditionally the label given Deathstroke is like he's the world's greatest assassin,
Mm-hmm.
And I said, well, that's not the book I want to write. I think Deathstroke is the world's worst dad.
Yeah.
He's the world's worst dad. This happens to be his day job, but for Deathstroke, it's like an addiction. He couldn't stop if he wanted to. In fact, our finale, spoiler alert, our finale is, he had actually quit the business And of course, he got dragged back in because of, I don't remember anymore, but he had to save somebody or do something. But uh, uh, actually, some bad guy killed his tech guy, this guy Hosun, who's actually a good friend of mine. So Hosun is like, hey, I got killed in Deathstroke. Anyway, and at the end of the series, he has solved whatever the problem is, and he's, going back to retirement, and he's like, nope, I'm all done with it. He has put the sword in a glass case somewhere. He hung up his spurs and so forth like that, but he really can't. He's an addict. He's addicted to that lifestyle. And ultimately, you turn around and he's gone and the case is broken. And
it was a fantastic ending. It was perfect.
Yeah. Thank you. So he was just a guy that, I looked at and I just asked myself all these questions about, like, what kind of toll does that lifestyle take on a man? First of all, what drives him to do that in the first place? And then, and then I thought, well, I had written Captain America, and Captain America and Superman are two of the hardest characters to write. They just are, because they're so good. They're so good, Right. And so with Cap, I was surrounding him with people who were less good. And for a while that included the Falcon, where I had, the Falcon playing John Lennon to Cap's Paul McCartney. And, and together they made this great music, but they came at it from two very different directions. And Bennett, I'm sorry, Joe Bennett. I'm so sorry, Joe. I forgot your name. This brilliant artist that he was really just taking heads when we were doing Captain America and the Falcon. And I was so amazingly disappointed when we didn't get to continue. Yeah. At any rate, so, with Deathstroke, I said, well, let me go back to Captain America, because his origin is absolutely Captain America. Let's go back to Captain America and what did Marv originally intend? And only Marv can speak for Marv. But I said, well, he is a dysfunctional Captain America. He is a guy who loves and wants to be loved, but is capable of neither. He is, if you ever see the show House MD, the Hugh Laurie series, he is House MD with a machine gun. So he has, a lot of those same triggers and those same limitations where, instead of just telling his daughter, I would really like to spend time with you. And his daughter worships him. Rose worships him, would love to spend time with him. Rather than say that, he engineers this whole phony thing where, like, oh, someone's out to kill Rose, so I must, take her into protective custody for her own good, right? And then we repeated the same bit, of Rose and Deathstroke going undercover and they're going across country, to find the killer or whatever, which is all fake, just because he just wanted to spend time with her. And we repeated that whole thing only with Damian Wayne. And I love Damian Wayne. I fell so in love with this kid. I adore Damian. He is a hoot to write, and and we repeated the exact same layouts, and it's the same car, it's the same disguises, and because they're having this weird custody battle over Damian because, right. It's too complicated to explain, but we did a whole Batman versus Deathstroke thing that was a lot of fun. And at some point, Damian finds out what's going on, and of course, he's not going to sit by the side. He's not the one to sit by the sidelines. Yeah. So he just presents himself to Deathstroke and goes, "Hello, father." Yeah. And Deathstroke's like, "I'm not your damn father," and he goes, "I knew you'd say that, father." It was just so much fun. I just giggled. I cackled over every page of that. And Bennis, Ed Bennis, thank you. He just went to town and drew the hell out of that story, and I'm just so grateful to him and so forth. But yeah, Deathstroke was just a lot of fun to write because there was all these emotional trap doors, but you could see that particularly when it came toward the end of the series and his involvement with Damian, was that I think that in Damien, he saw the son that he lost.
Mm.
You know, Grant, the son that was killed. You know, I think he saw in Damien, and Damien, you know, oh, I despise Deathstroke. I want to kill Deathstroke, and he would kind of just ruffle his hair. You know, I mean, he just, you know, I really think that when we were doing the whole custody battle thing, you know, I was begging for 6 months. I said, look, you know, the whole question was who is Damien's father? Is it Bruce Wayne or is it Deathstroke? You know, and I was begging DC to let it be Deathstroke. I said, you know, imagine the hell that would break loose.
Yeah.
Or, you know, and you know, it's probably impolitic to say, but I don't care. Dan said no. And I think ultimately it was Dan's decision. Well, we had big plans for Damien. We can't upset those big plans. They had no plans for Damien. You know, I mean, they had plans, but they didn't have, you know, nothing that this would have.
Yeah, nothing this would have opened up a lot of more story avenues.
Oh my God, yes, it would have been hilarious.
Yeah,
you know. So I was at C2E2, and I was having lunch with Tom Brevoort and CB over at Marvel, you know. And I told him that story, you know, what we were up to, and that I said, yeah, I wanted Deathstroke to be Damien's dad, but you don't let me do it, you know. And I looked at CB and I said, well, you know, what would you guys do? And he just laughed. He said, are you kidding me? We could have got a whole year out of, like, you know, the search for the truth, you know, and we would have milked the hell out of that thing, you know. And it was just, you know, it's just one of those, you know, moments. But I think that, you know, there was a great affinity between Deathstroke and Robin, which is why they pretend to hate each other so much.
Right.
They don't, in fact, hate each other. You know, in fact, there's like this moment where Deathstroke ends up saving Damien, or at least pretending to save Damien. You know, and lots of, you know, or you know, where Deathstroke wakes up and he finds Damien like standing watch, and and he has this moment where, you know, he's truly admiring, you know, this character. And if you really stop and think about it, Damien, the character, is much more like Slade Wilson than he is like Bruce Wayne.
Yeah. When I first heard that, I was like, okay, well, to me, it makes more sense that Damien would be Slade's son than Bruce Wayne's son. You know, he acts, but Damien's a jerk, much more like, I mean, don't get me wrong, Batman can be a jerk too, but he's more kind of the cold calculating, where Slade's kind of the in your face F you kind of guy, which is more like Damien. But the other thing that's fantastic about that run, like, it's so consistent for, you know, from issue 1 to issue 50. It's so much about family and about kind of the thin line between love and hate, right? Like, Slade wouldn't be getting so pissed off at his family members if he didn't care, right? He would just be like, whatever, I don't care. But the fact that there's so much animosity there shows that there's emotion, you know, and it's so consistent. It's just like those 50 issues are just such a fantastic run. I would say to anybody who hasn't read it, any of you listeners, definitely check it out. But it's not a run where jump in, jump out, read this volume or that.
Yeah, start from the beginning.
Yeah, you got to start from the beginning, and you got to read the whole thing, because you definitely had like a beginning, middle, and end. Such a journey for Slade, and he comes out the other side, I think, with a better understanding of who he is, and I think we as fans and readers have a better understanding of who he is. So
we also see that Slade does have the capacity to love. He just doesn't realize it, because we see him exercise that, you know, in several areas, including with Tanya, the Black Power girl.
Yep.
You know, he absolutely falls in love with her, unequivocally falls in love with her, and you know, and he's always conniving ways to bring her back into his orbit and so forth. Yep. And then there was this you know, I was able to do this thing where we had Jericho, the son, the deaf son. We had him sort of come out as bisexual, and you know, nobody really screamed at us. And thankfully Marv didn't assault me when I ran into him. I don't know where his stand was on that, but so Jericho was involved with one of Deathstroke's tech guys, who ultimately becomes like this monster. I don't want to give all the bullet points away, but the guy is like the guy that Jericho was involved with. He is a gay born again Christian, and I know many gay born again Christians. I have my gay friends and I have my pastor friends, and and sometimes they're a combination thereof. Right. So I was writing what I know, and I thought that was kind of like a really treacherous path to tread, because you're bound to offend all kinds of people, but the fact is, it's like I don't believe that your spirituality and your sexuality need to be mutually exclusive. Right. I think that I don't think that God makes mistakes. I think that we are who we are. And as a pastor, my job is to connect people to God and let God and people work all that other stuff out, but not for me to, do that kind of thing. So there was this issue, I think it was issue 20. I don't know how I got away with this, but I did an issue where almost the entire issue was narrated by passages from the Bible, and we have this hulking, monstrous, murderous, creature, and he's stalking through his cave, and the narrative is like, he was despised of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and we turned as it was our faces from him. It's that whole passage from Isaiah, and I just knew that was going to come like hurling back at my head so fast. And yet it sailed through it, and DC approved it, and it's in print now, and it's one of my favorite issues. There's a scene in that issue where the Slade is on the plane with his son, with Jericho, and the evil guy calls up to the plane, and he talks to Jericho, and this is a guy that Jericho tried to kill. Yeah. And the guy forgives him. He's on the phone. He goes, hey, don't hang on to that. I forgive you. And Jericho just dissolves. It just breaks apart. When he hears this. But there's all this stuff where every now and then, even in Vampirella, which I'm writing now, every now and then, and thank you for this, my publishers will let me hang out my pastor shingle. And I get to go. I'm not proselytizing, Jace. I'm not trying to, if you want to worship fire hydrants, and turn in circles, I'm with you. I'll join you. I'll take a shot at it. Right. So I'm really not trying to recruit you for my team, but I just think like, all over Twitter and all over the TV and so forth, there's all this hate and anger. Everybody's angry about something, anger, and everybody's, yelling at each other, and I'm thinking like, we should kind of like, give each other a break. And that's what that scene was about. That's what that issue was about. It was about forgiveness, and it was about how much power it is when you let go of some of that stuff and just hit reset, and people can just kind of, move on with their lives. But I think it was issue 20. I was just amazed that ended up in print. And I think I posted an op-ed about it, thanking DC, and kind of pimping that issue, whatever like that. And I got a call on Saturday from Bob Harris. I've known Bob Harris for 40 years. I've never gotten a call from Bob Harris on a Saturday. What did you do? What do you mean? You posted, and everybody's up in arms. I go, did you actually read what I said? I don't even know what that was about, but it upset so many people in the ivory tower up there, DC. I thought they were going to cancel the book and send a hitman after me, And if you read that piece, it's just thank you, DC, for letting me do this. I didn't expect to be allowed to, but you did. And I don't know why that upset them or why all of a sudden, wow, Saturday morning, I'm halfway through my Cheerios and my cartoons and here's Bob Harris, so go figure.
Well, it's a fantastic run, everybody, and as is Black Panther. And you mentioned Vampirella that you're currently working on. So as we're winding up here, Christopher, it's been fantastic talking to you. Why don't you let everybody know, if you can, anything you have upcoming that you want us to be on the lookout for and what you're currently working on.
I so want to do that. There is so much stuff of mine coming out in the next 12 to 18 months that you're going to just be sick of me. Unfortunately, I have to wait for this stuff to be announced.
Gotcha. No problem.
There is, we are halfway through our Dracula Vampirella thing. There is another Vampirella thing, waiting at the bus stop just on the other side of that. There's two series from DC that will be coming out starting 2022. There's a Marvel thing that's wrapping up. There is a heavy metal series that will be launching in the summer. And there is a book I created for humanoids that will be launching sometime this year as well. None of which I can tell you about because the publishers have not announced it, but they actually do exist. I am so busy.
Well, I'm just glad to hear that we have so much Christopher Priest because I was wondering if maybe you were just kind of winding things down again to go on another break, but it sounds like that's the furthest thing from the truth. You've been hard at work, and it's all coming.
I'm typing my little fingers off, Jace.
Well, fantastic. Maybe we'll have you back on when some of these things get announced to talk about them. If anybody wants to follow along with you, do you do any social media? If anybody wants to know when these things are coming?
I am not on social media. I'm really sorry. I have a website that I neglect. It's probably like, oh my gosh, it's got cobwebs on it. But there is ChristopherPriest.com out there somewhere, and I should update my blog one of these centuries. I just haven't had a chance to get around to it.
Well, what I'll tell all you listeners is if you're big Christopher Priest fans, just make sure you continue listening to the Comic Source because when Christopher has stuff coming out, we're going to cover it. So again, Priest, it's been fantastic chatting with you, man. I truly do believe that you are a legend. You've done so many fantastic things, worked on just about every character there is. And yeah, for me, that Deathstroke just stands head and shoulders above anybody else's. I'm not putting anybody else's stuff down. Everybody else's stuff is great. Yours is just that much better. So great chatting with you. Really appreciate the time. And yeah, it's been a real pleasure.
Hey, thank you so much, Jace. And you have a great weekend. We'll talk again.
Yep. And to all you listeners, we really want to thank you for joining us. As always, appreciate the support, and we'll talk to you next time.